Hello everyone, so we're going to go through a Nat 5 Modern Studies study skills session, and what we're going to do throughout the video is look into the describe question, the explain question, how to answer both of those properly to give yourself the best chance of getting full marks, and we're also going to look at the three source handling skill questions. We're going to break them down, we're going to work out the best approach, look at the structures a little bit and take it from there, alright? Okay, so the first type of question we are going to look at is the describe question. A describe question asks you to present a picture of something in words, highlighting important characteristics or features. These are worth 6 marks in your exam, which means you shouldn't really spend maybe more than 10 minutes answering each question that is a describe question. These require less detail than an explain question and follow the peel structure for your answer. We're going to look into the peel structure in a few slides time, so don't worry about that too much just now. These can appear in any section of the exam. So the second type of question we're going to look at is the explain question. Now these are really similar to the describe questions. Explain questions require you to provide facts or reasons to make something clear and understandable. So these require more detail than a describe in order to get the marks. A good tip to ensure that you are actually explaining and not just describing is to always make sure that explain part of your peel answer has a because or another kind of linking word that shows you're actually developing the point. So again, you should use the peel structure, which we're going to look at in the next slide. These also can appear anywhere in the exam paper and are also worth 6 marks. So again, you shouldn't be spending really any more than about 10-11 minutes on these. A really good tip is to answer both the describe and explain questions the same way. This extra detail in a describe question can really help you pick up some marks, and it gets you into good practice for your explain questions. Alright, so we're going to look at how to structure your answer for both describe and explain questions. So the structure we're going to follow is a peel structure, and the peel stands for point, explain, example and link. For your point, you want to use this to answer the question and introduce what you're talking about. We'll go through some examples of this as well. For your explain section of your answer, you want to go into more detail and tell the reader what you mean. Like I said when we were talking about explain questions, you could use words like because to make sure that you're developing your point. Once you've done that, you're going to give an example, which is a detailed, real-world example to back up your point and actually show it in action. This really proves your explain. Then you're going to link your response to the question and use the exact wording of the question. Again, on the next slide, we can go through some examples of that. So on this slide, we have a little example of how you use the peel structure. Now, the example we've got here just now isn't a modern studies specific example, just to get you thinking about how to do it, alright? So, if I were to ask you to describe your favourite subject in school, your point would be, my favourite subject is modern studies. Now, notice how we've used favourite subject in the kind of question prompt and also in our point, alright? So we're using that same language every time we approach this answer. We're using the language of the question. Going out to the explain, we're expanding that a little bit, we're opening that up a little bit. So we're saying in modern studies, we learn about important world events in interesting ways. Alright, so you've explained then your point, which is that your favourite subject is modern studies. An example could be that one world event we learn about is the Syrian war. Then to link that back to your question, you would say, this shows why modern studies is my favourite subject, as I am interested in the content. Now notice again here in our link that we have used the same language as the question and in our point. So as you see in the question, there is favourite subject. In our point it says. So on this slide, we have a little example of how you use the peel structure. Now, the example we've got here just now isn't a modern studies specific example, just to get you thinking about how to do it, alright? So, if I were to ask you to describe your favourite subject in school, your point would be, my favourite subject is modern studies. Now, notice how we've used favourite subject in the kind of question prompt and also inner point. Alright, so we're using that same language every time we approach this answer. We're using the language of the question. Going into the explain, we're expanding that a little bit, we're opening that up a little bit. So we're saying in modern studies we learn about important world events in interesting ways. Alright, so you've explained then your point, which is that your favourite subject is modern studies. An example could be that one world event we learn about is the Syrian war. Then to link that back to your question, you would say, this shows why modern studies is my favourite subject as I am interested in the content. Now notice again here in our link that we have used the same language as the question and inner point. So as you see in the question there is favourite subject, in our point it says favourite subject, and again with our link sentence it says favourite subject. Alright, it's important to have that key theme so that the marker knows that you know exactly what you're talking about and that the link and your point is clearly related to the question. Let's now have a look at a model answer for a describe or explain question that's a bit more familiar to the Modern Studies course than the previous one. So the question is to describe or explain. It doesn't really matter because we're going to approach these questions the exact same way and it could appear either way in the exam. So describe or explain two political causes of an international conflict or issue you have studied. Now it's really important in this particular unit that you mention in your answer that you are studying Syria. Alright, so you're going to start off your answer by saying one political cause of the war in Syria is protests. Now that's you making a clear point, so you'd get a mark for that because it's an accurate and clear point. You're then going on to describe that point by saying the Arab Spring protests caused the start of the war and protests have continued. Many people want more rights and freedoms and do not like Assad, the Syrian leader. So that's you made a clear explanation there. Alright, then you're going to move on and back that up again with an example. So you're going to say, for example, in 2020 there were protests about Assad's failure to tackle the economy. After you've made your example, you're going to link that back to the question. So as you can see, this shows that protests are a political cause of the war in Syria. That clearly links back to your point, but it also clearly links back to the question, which is asking you for a political cause of an international conflict or issue you've studied. Remember, this is worth 6 marks and you've only picked up 3 so far. The link sentence does not get you a mark, but really helps add to your explanation, and it means the marker's not in any doubt about what you're talking about. So moving on, you still get 3 marks to pick up, so you're going to need to make another point. And as you'll notice, the question asks for 2 political causes of an international conflict. So your second point is that another political cause of the war in Syria is because of support from other countries. You're then going to go in and explain that by saying that some countries like Russia have helped the Syrian government fight rebels, making it harder for other countries like the USA to intervene. Then move on to an example by saying, for example, Russia has provided over 50,000 soldiers. So that would be your 3 marks. But just to make sure, again, that the marker's in no doubt about what message you're trying to send, you're going to link that back by saying this shows that support from other countries like Russia is a political cause of the war in Syria. Again, using the clear language from the point you've made in that paragraph, but also linking back to the clear language that's given in the question. Alright, so now we've looked at the describe and explain questions and how to answer them. We're going to move on to the source questions. So first I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how the kind of source questions are structured in the exam. Alright, so there are 3 source questions in the National 5 Modern Studies exam paper. All of the information you need for these questions is in the sources. So the good news is you don't need any prior knowledge, you don't need to go in with any knowledge, you don't need to know anything about what the question's about, it's all going to be in front of you. What is being tested here is your ability to look through those sources for key points of information and use them properly within an answer. So these source questions in your Modern Studies exam are worth 10 marks each, and there are 3 different types of source question in the. So the first of the 3 source questions we're going to look at is the support oppose question. Now, like I said in the previous slide, this is a skills question, and as such you will be assessed not on the knowledge you already have, but on your ability to read, analyse and present information in a particular way. So again, the good news is you don't actually require any knowledge of the topic itself. You'll simply be given the view of someone, and based on the evidence in front of you that you'll find in the sources, you need to decide if you support their view or if you oppose their view. Now, when you get these questions, there is no right or wrong answer in terms of whether you support or oppose the view. There will be evidence to back up both, so don't worry too much about that. Personally, I tend to approach the sources first before I decide on whether I'm going to support or oppose. Just really, I focus on whatever jumps out at me first. But again, you can go in either with the view to support, the view to oppose, and that won't really matter as long as you're using the right information to back up the support and the oppose. Alright. So as I previously said, the support and oppose question, like all the other skills questions, does not require you to have any prior knowledge. But the downfall of that is that the question contains a lot of information. And when I say the question, what I mean is the three sources. And like I said, it is usually laid out with three different sections known as sources, alright? At least one source will contain written information, for example, background information, facts about the issue, and or personal opinions about the issue. And at least one source contains statistical information. So that's things like graphs, charts, results of surveys and tables. It's really important that you pay close attention, particularly to the graphs, charts, results of surveys and tables, as it's not always very obvious what they're trying to say. Sometimes they can be tricky and will catch you out if you don't pay really close attention. As for the other two sources, they will have written information. Again, you need to be really careful because there will be things throughout those sources that are there to throw you off. Alright, so it's really important that you really pay close attention to the detail in the sources and make sure that you read things over when you're using them in your answer. So as I said, you'll be given a statement or the view of someone usually in these questions that you're going to either have to support or oppose based on the evidence you have in front of you. So like I said, the question provides you with this statement and it's your job to find out what information in the sources agree with the statement as well as the information that disagree with the statement. The statement is located at the very end of the question, which is why what I'm about to tell you next is going to sound strange, but the first thing you should actually do, despite the fact that the statement is at the end of the question, is to read the statement carefully. Now, the reason you do that is so that when you are actually looking into the sources, you already know what kind of information you're looking for. It wouldn't make sense to read through all three sources and then your statement, because you would need to go back, read through them anyway, read through the sources again anyway, and try and work out what points support the statement and what points oppose the statement. But if you've already read that statement before you've even looked at the sources, you already know what type of information you're looking for. So it's really vital that you read the statement and you read the statement carefully, because again, it is National 5, they might try and throw you off sometimes. It's really important that you pay close attention to all the details. Alright, so now we've discussed how the question appears in terms of sources and in terms of a statement. We can discuss how you would maybe write your answer. So, your response must include 10 separate bits of evidence from the sources. That's where your 10 marks are coming from. You get 1 mark for each time you use a bit of evidence correctly to either support or oppose the statement that's given to you in the question. At least one point you're making from the sources must support the statement, and at least one point that you use from the sources must oppose the statement. By the end of your whole answer, you must have used all three of the sources, and it's really important that in your answer, you make sure that the marker knows what source you're getting each piece of information from. Alright, so again, you don't need to support or oppose the statement outright. You do need to use both a support and oppose. It doesn't really matter what one you do, as long as you are using both at some point. It doesn't matter if you use 8 support, 2 oppose, 9 support, 1 oppose, or 5 and 5. Alright, the most important thing is you are looking at both sides. So, Well, now at the point where you've read your statement, you're beginning to look at the sources, you're beginning to find the information that you're going to use in your answer. The way I've always approached this, and I've done this even when I sat my Nat 5 as well, what I done and what most people do, and it tends to work for them, is they get two different coloured highlighters for this question, and when they're reading through the sources, remember you've already read the statement so you know what you're looking for. When you're reading through the sources, I would use one coloured highlighter to highlight any evidence that I could use to support the view or the statement that's given, and then I would use a different colour to highlight anything that opposes the statement or view that's given. Alright, and what I'd do is I'd read through all my sources, highlighting anything I could possibly use before I even think about how I'm going to write my answer. Once I've gathered all those pieces of information together and colour coded them correctly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to write down my answer. Alright, so we're going to talk about how you present the information on the day. You will use a template which will guide you through how to structure your answer, and that template looks something like this. So if I've got a piece of evidence that supports the statement, I would simply put one reason to support the statement is in source, let's say source A, which shows, and then I would directly quote what I've taken from the source. Alright, and then what I do after that is I'd use then a second piece of evidence and go, another reason to support the statement is in source C, which shows, and again you're quoting the exact wording of the source. Alright, if you're using a graph or stat from the source that's going to present that type of information, be very, very careful to use the correct figures and make sure that you're using it properly. Make sure you read the graph or the chart or whatever it is that you're going to be using. So you're going to do this, like we said, 10 times, and that's where your 10 marks is going to be from. Now, I've just used two examples of how I'd answer the support of the statement. However, like I said, you're going to need to, at some point, support and oppose in your answer. But it's not a big change when you're doing the opposite of what you've done the last time. So in our case, that would be oppose just now. I would be saying one reason to oppose the statement is in source B, which shows, and then again I would quote or directly take any statistic that I might find. Again, it's really, really important that you have both a mixture of support and oppose in your answer. Again, it doesn't need to be evenly balanced. It can be heavily on the support side or heavily on the oppose side, but what's most important is that both are taken into account. So again, one reason to support the statement in source A is, and then you would quote, and then you're going to say what that shows, and then again I really need to hammer that in and say that you do need to use both a support and oppose. We have 10 marks available to us, so we are making 10 full sentences based on either supporting or opposing the statement that we have been given. Alright. So the statement in the question we're looking at just now is that there have been great improvements in the UK's health in the last 10 years, and that's according to Sophie Wilson. So what do we need to find out exactly? Basically, what we need to do is we need to find evidence to show that the UK's health has improved, and that would be our evidence in support of that statement. And then we have to find evidence that opposes that statement, which is essentially evidence to show that the UK's health has not improved. And you need to, and remember again, find evidence from all three sources throughout your answer. So on this slide, you'll find an example of how support statements should look in your answer. So just to remind you, the statement and the answer, or the question rather, that we're looking at was that there have been great improvements in the UK's health in the last 10 years, and that statement was made by Sophie Wilson. So, based on evidence from the three sources that that question provides, your answer could look something like this. One reason to support the statement is source 1, where it shows the average life expectancy in 2003 was 77 years. In 2013, it was 80 years. Another reason to support the statement in source 1 shows life expectancy in the UK has increased because we are making better lifestyle choices about our health, such as eating healthier food and exercising more. So that's two examples there from the sources that you could use to support Sophie Wilson's statement. However, there is far more sources, information from the sources rather, that supported the statement as well. So I could have used many more there. So you would lay out your opposed statements in the exact same way you would lay out your support statements when answering the question. So if you have a look on the slide just now, you'll see it's really similar, except the word support is changing to oppose. So, for example, one reason to oppose a statement is the source 1, where it says, since 2004, the number of obese children suffering from diabetes has doubled. Another reason to oppose the statement is source 1, where it says, if studies are accurate, half of adults in the UK will be obese by 2030. And then lastly, the obesity rate rising from 25% in Scotland in 2004 to 30% in 2014. So these are all points that clearly oppose the view of Sophie Wilson that the UK's health has improved in the past 10 years. Again, there was more examples in the sources, but that's just a few, like in the previous slide, just to give you an understanding of how these answers should look. So remember, overall, between your whole answer and a mix of support and opposed statements, you need 10 of them backed up by evidence from the sources. So now that we've looked at our first skill question, which is the support and oppose question, we're going to move on and have a look at the option choice questions. Now this again worth 10 marks and you will be dealing with 3 different sources, alright? It's a really similar skills that you're having to use here, but we will go through the details on how to answer these and tackle these effectively and properly in the next few slides. So like I said, you're using similar skills and these questions appear similarly to support and oppose, but there are some key differences. In an option choice question, you're required to make a decision between 2 different options, again, that will be presented to you on the question. You then need to justify in detail your decision based on evidence between 2 and 4 sources. Usually that's going to be 3 sources, like all of the other skills, alright? In this one, kind of similar to the support and oppose, you also need to show an awareness of an alternative view. So in that regard, it's not too different from your support and oppose insofar as you are supporting one option, opposing the other option that the question gives you, but still showing that awareness that there is another option and that it is maybe a viable one based on some evidence in the sources. So again, don't overcomplicate it. These skills questions are really similar in terms of how you approach them, the kind of skills you're using, and what we're going to do over the next few slides is look at the kind of key specifics of the option choice question and how to answer it well. So let's look at the fundamental aspects of the option choice question. So like the other skill questions, and like I've already mentioned, this is worth 10 marks. In this question, you should have 5 separate paragraphs, which means you could get 2 marks from each paragraph, alright? Much like the support and oppose question, you must use information from all of the sources that are given to you. You should spend roughly 17.5 minutes on this question. So when you're studying or when you're looking through things at home, especially as things get closer to the exam, what you should be doing is timing yourself with these and make sure you're only giving yourself about that 17.5, maybe 18 minutes to answer them. Alright, in these questions, you must demonstrate an ability to synthesize. That means use evidence from different sources in your paragraphs. Alright, you must also be able to interpret data and you're going to have to show that. But again, that's not too different from your support and oppose question like we just discussed. The skills that you're using here are really similar. You need to use them in a slightly different way in the option choice question at times, but fundamentally it's not too different. So again, don't worry too much. So like I said, you're going to be presented with 2 different options in this question. So in an options question, you're presented with a scenario and asked to make a recommendation. You're usually like a government advisor or something, and you're given a scenario where you're going to give 2 options and you're going to recommend to the government what one is the best. That's usually how they appear. Like I said, you will be provided with 2 options. You must come down on one of them as your preferred option. Again, it doesn't really matter which one you choose, as the questions are always designed in such a way there's enough information and evidence from the 3 different sources to back up either option that you decide to go with. Alright, so let's look at the one on this screen here. So question 12 says, study sources 1, 2 and 3 and then answer the question which follows. So here it's like I said, you're a government advisor. So this one says you are a government advisor. You've been asked to recommend whether or not the United Kingdom's government should ban legal highs. Now option 1 is to ban legal highs. Option 2 is the opposite. Do not ban legal highs. Again, it doesn't matter which one you pick. There will be enough information and evidence from the 3 sources to back up either. Alright, so again, don't get too caught up in what one you're picking, what one you're not picking. Again, I would always start off by looking at the scenario, at the 2 options, and then look through my sources. And again, when I was doing my Nat 5, the way I done this was I just looked at it, started to look through the sources, and whichever information kind of was jumping out to me more first was the option I went for. I never really allowed personal opinions on any particular topic have too much influence in my answer. You always go with whatever information is just kind of jumping out at you from the sources. Again, be sure to be really careful when you're reading through the sources and when you're reading the options. It's really important that you understand what you're trying to back up and what you're not trying to back up. So again, paying that really close attention to detail throughout all these skill questions is very, very important. Let's have a look at how you'd approach the option choice question. So once you've made your choice, start reading and annotating the source evidence. You're looking for information or evidence to support the option that you have made. Remember, you will need enough evidence for 4 whole paragraphs. So, if you use the example below, if you chose option 1, which was to ban legal highs, what you'd be looking for in the 3 sources is evidence to reflect that legal highs need to be banned. Alright? You should also at this stage annotate any information that suggests that you should not ban legal highs or that opposes the option that you have chosen, because ultimately you do need to use this for your final paragraph. So now that we've had a look at how the option choice question presents itself and some of the kind of key components of it, we can have a look at how we might look at or think about answering the question. So like I said, you're going to be asked to recommend either option 1 or option 2. So you must start your question, or must start the answer with the statement, I recommend either option 1 or option 2. After you've established what option you're going to be recommending, you then start to justify that, and you're going to do that over 4 different paragraphs, alright? And again, how you're going to answer this is quite straightforward. So you're going to start off by saying, one reason I chose this option is in source, wherever you happen to find your information, where it says, and then you're going to quote directly again, just like you did in your support and oppose. Now at this stage, it becomes a little bit different. So in your support and oppose, you're just finding 10 pieces of information and saying whether they support or oppose the view or statement that you're given, alright? Whereas in this one, you then need to, after you've already found your first piece of evidence that led you to your particular option, you then need to back it up by something in another source, alright? So you need to find something in maybe a different source that links to the initial quote that you've made. So if in source 1, for example, there was something that says that legal highs should be banned because they're bad for your health, and then in source 3 there's something that says something very similar, then you would link those 2 together, alright? You would say this is backed up, and then use a piece of evidence to really reinforce the initial piece of evidence you've used to back up. You're going to do that 4 times. So altogether, you'll be looking for 8 quotes that really back up the option that you've recommended. But again, it's really important that these quotes are related to one another in each part of the paragraph. So you can't just pick 2 random quotes that are going to support the recommendation that you've chosen. Alright, you need to be very, very careful about that. Make sure that they are talking about similar things. You're then, in your final paragraph, going to acknowledge the other side and you're going to find information to back up the other side. The way you would write that down on the exam paper is by saying that some people might choose the other option because in source, say A, it states, but then instead of linking that and backing that up again, you're going to say, but I actually still choose my option because in source whatever, it shows that, and again, you're going to quote that. Now, Overall then, that means you need 9 quotes that back up the option you're recommending, but it's really important that you do acknowledge the other side and take a piece of evidence that does support the other side in your answer to get full marks. So here's an exemplar paragraph from the question that we previously looked at. If you remember, the two options were to either ban legal highs or not to ban legal highs. Option 1 was to ban legal highs. So the paragraph should look like this. A reason to support option 1 can be found in source 1 where it states, and as you can see a direct quote here, the UK has the most severe problem with legal highs in Western Europe. You're then going to say that this is backed up by source 2, which shows that in 2015 there were 115 deaths from legal high in the UK compared to the EU average of only 60 deaths. So as you can see, that you're saying that you support option 1 in the paragraph, and you're taking two clear bits of evidence that link with each other to back your choice up. Remember, after you've written the 4 paragraphs in support of the option you have chosen, you need to write a final paragraph, and that paragraph requires you to explain why you did not choose the other option. You need to find a reason to support the other option, but then give a contradictory piece of evidence to prove that the reason doesn't have merit. We're going to look at an example on the next slide. In this paragraph, you're essentially explaining why you didn't choose the other option, even if there was some evidence to support it. So let's look at the first sentence here. I did not choose option 2 because although in source 3 it states that the Irish government banned legal highs after a number of deaths linked to their use, however this did not reduce deaths and was unsuccessful. Source 1 says that they must be banned as these drugs are often included in everyday household products and are labelled not for human consumption. So as you can see, the evidence from source 3 does back up the other option, which is option 2, not to ban legal highs. However, source 1 completely cancels it out with its evidence, so it's really important that you do give that strong point to support the other option, but ultimately come back in that with another piece of evidence to support the option you went with, just to reinforce why you've chosen that option. So the final skill question we're going to look at in this session is the conclusions question. The conclusions question is again worth 10 marks and will ask you to draw conclusions about 4 different bullet points that will be provided to you in the question. Again, my recommendation would be to go straight to these points and read them before you start to tackle your 3 sources. So before we start attempting to draw conclusions, we should probably establish what a conclusion actually is. So what exactly is a conclusion? Well, a conclusion is basically a statement or a judgment about something that you're kind of saying definitively, based on the evidence that you know, this is your point of view. That's the judgment you're making on something. In the context of modelling studies, this skill-based question tests your ability to make a number of conclusions on a specific topic using a variety of source evidence. So again, much like the previous 2 skills that we've looked at, you are dealing with 3 sources and you're going to be using those sources to come up with an answer on a scenario you're prompted with. In this case, the scenario you're prompted with is 4 bullet points that you need to make conclusions on. Now again, conclusions are statements or judgments about that, about the thing that's given to you. Alright. So let's have a look at our conclusion question checklist. So a conclusion question is a skill-based question, and again, it's worth 10 marks. So again, you should only be spending approximately 17 to 18 minutes on it in your exam. So again, what I would be recommending on the build up to prelims and exams and stuff like that is to really practice these timed. So on your phone, whatever, put an 18-minute timer and try and get the question answered in that time. Remember now, that isn't an awful lot of time when you've got 3 sources you need to read through and make conclusions about 4 different statements. So you should have 4 paragraphs and each paragraph links to its own separate bullet point or conclusion, which again is given to you in the question. You must use all of the sources available again. You must use evaluative language. You must try and synthesize evidence from across the different sources, and there is only one conclusion question in the exam, but it can appear anywhere in any of the 3 units, so absolutely anywhere in the exam. Alright. So just to be clear about what you've been asked to do here, you've been asked to draw 4 conclusions with prompts from the question using 3 sources of information. You need to support and detail each conclusion you make using the evidence from between the 3 sources of information. Again, you're going to have to link the evidence that you're using between the sources. It is vital in this question that you use evaluative language so that it's clear to the marker that you are making a judgment on each statement. So as I previously mentioned, the use of evaluative language is absolutely critical when you're answering conclusion questions. So let's just be clear about what evaluative language actually is. Evaluative language includes positive, negative, or neutral words and expressions that convey a judgment or an appraisal. The use of such language indicates your considered attitude to the particular topic, and that essentially means what is your critical position on the topic, and in the case of the conclusion question, the bullet points. If you look below, you see some examples of kind of common evaluative language that we could use in these type of questions. So you could be maybe asked to compare something like you are in the model answer we're going to look at in a moment. So you can see here, like, compared to is a good example of evaluative language. You could talk about increases, decreases, rise, fall, successful, unsuccessful, majority, minority, all those type of examples where you're making a clear judgment on something, a statement of giving value to something, essentially. We're now going to look at an actual example of one of these questions. So like I said before, the question will direct you to 4 bullet points. And again, you must make a separate conclusion about each of these to secure full marks. Alright, so if you looked at the slide just now, you'll see that there's 4 bullet points like would be presented in a question. You'll notice that the question says, using sources 1, 2 and 3, what conclusions can be drawn? Again, reaffirming that you need to use evidence from all 3 sources. It then says you should reach a conclusion about each of the following. First bullet point is the problem of crime in Japan compared to other countries. The second is the effects of the changing population structure in Japan. The third is the effects of poverty on working age women. And the last one is the country most like Japan. It then says your conclusion must be supported by evidence from the sources. You should link information within and between sources in support of your conclusions. Your answer must be based on all 3 sources. One good hint is to number each bullet point 1, 2, 3 and 4. This means when you read the sources and come across evidence, you can write down the number of the conclusion that the evidence relates to. And this is going to save you a lot of time in the long run. Because remember, you will only have around 18 minutes to complete this question. It's also a good idea to highlight the keywords or underline the keywords in each bullet point. So this is how the conclusion question would appear on the exam paper, and if you look to the bottom right hand corner there, you'll see the exact same 4 bullet points that we just looked at in the previous slide. We're now going to move on and do a model answer for the first bullet point, which is the problem of crime in Japan compared to other countries. So we're now going to look at how we review the evidence. So like I said, the first thing you should do is read the bullet points. Then you should read through your sources and highlight the key pieces of evidence that you're going to use that you think links to the bullet points that the question's provided. After you've done that, reread the bullet points and really make sure you know what it's asking you to make a conclusion about. Then you should start to think about what statement or conclusion you could come up with regarding each bullet point. Think about which pieces of evidence you're going to use to back up your statement. In other words, how are you going to back up your conclusion? Remember, it is vital to pay attention to the language and evaluative words used in the bullet point. The bullet point that we're going to write a quick model answer for is bullet point 1. and that is looking at the problem of crime compared to other countries in regards to Japan, as the question is asking. So notice here that it talks about crime being a problem, and then it's asking you essentially to compare it to other countries. So one conclusion that it's looking for you to draw in that bullet point is the comparison. If you think back to the evaluative slide, the evaluative language slide, you will have noticed as well that words like compared to featured. We're now going to have a look at how you would structure the answer to the conclusion question. You're going to start every paragraph the exact same way. You're going to put the bullet point from the question as a heading 4 times, 4 different bullet points. When you're actually writing your paragraph, the first thing you're going to do is make your conclusion. So that's your statement or judgment. Make sure you've used key words from the bullet point. Then you're going to provide your first piece of evidence to support the conclusion that you've just made. That's going to be a piece of evidence from one of the 3 sources. You're then going to provide the second piece of evidence to back this up. After that, you should sum it all up with a "this shows" sentence, ensuring you've used evaluative language. So this is kind of similar to the link in the describe and explain peel structure. Alright, you're going to do this 4 times throughout your answer, 1 time for each bullet point that's given by the question, and you can tackle your conclusions in whatever order you choose, so you don't need to do it based on what one is at the top of the list on the question. So now that we've established the key steps, let's have a look at a template for your answer. So it's going to look something like this. A conclusion that can be made about this is, and then at that point, you're going to insert your conclusion. And again, this is your statement or judgment about the bullet point. You're then going to say the evidence to support this is in source, wherever you found the evidence, and then you're going to quote that directly, alright? You're going to insert the source evidence. You're then going to say this is backed up by source, wherever you found the evidence to back your point up. When it states, and again, insert source evidence. Quote it, and if it's statistical information, remember to include the actual statistical evidence. Alright. You're going to finish off your paragraph by saying, this shows, and at that point, you're summarising your key findings and conclusion in your own words, and make sure that you're using evaluative language. And we're going to look into that in the next model answer. So we're now going to look at a model answer for the question that we looked at previously. Now just to remind you, bullet point 1 in that question was looking at the problem of crime compared to other countries, and the question was related to Japan. So the first thing we're doing in our answer is drawing our conclusion. So you're being really explicit about that in the language that you use as well. You're saying a conclusion that can be made about this is Japan has very low levels of crime when compared to some of the other European countries listed. So there you have done what the question is asking you to do, and that you have made a clear conclusion. You're then going to say evidence to support this is in source 1, where it states Japan had 22 crimes per 1,000 people in 2014. So that is a clear first piece of evidence from one of your sources. Once you move on, you're going to say that this is backed up in source 2, which shows that the figures for Germany are significantly higher at 79 crimes per 1,000 people, and France also has a high crime rate at 61 crimes per 1,000 people. The figure for the European Union average is almost 4 times greater than Japan with 80 crimes per 1,000 people. So there you have a clear second piece of evidence that's clearly related to the first piece of evidence. You're doing exactly what the bullet points asked you to do there as well by bringing in other countries, so you're comparing Japan's crime rates. Then you're going to finish off your paragraph by saying, this shows that the amount of crime taking place in Japan is much lower, and as you can see there, that's clear evaluative language. You're making a clear point that it is lower than, and then you're going to say than that taking place in European countries. In fact, it only represents a quarter of the figure, and that is your clear this shows. So that paragraph on the screen just now is a good example of a paragraph that would get full marks for that bullet point.